Okay, I'll just say first off, thanks to Anya for going first. I had a little bit of trouble hearing, so I hopefully will be able to interact properly. I want to thank, of course, Ben for inviting me and for organizing the conference, and of course, thanks for reading my very long and ridiculous title. Okay, so I want to say first off that what I'm going to present is a work in progress, and it's part of an current investigation. I'm thinking a lot about the rhetoric, the aesthetics, and the ethics of contemporary new materialisms, neo-vitalisms, and post-humanisms, and trying to rethink ways of understanding the category of the human versus the non-human and the natural and the environment within these discourses. So what I'm going to present is kind of just something that builds out of that. So I want to begin maybe with an odd proposal that binary code, as in the digital, provides for us a useful shorthand for thinking our current moment, and particularly in the context of the current crises that we face, from economic crises to environmental ones, and of course, crises of identity. The binary, we might say, is a useful expression of crisis insofar as it represents a logic of conflict. So I'm drawing here from points made in different ways by Alexander Galloway and Roberta Simonovsky. As Simonovsky puts it, the basic principle of the online filter bubble is antagonistic. Someone or something belongs or doesn't belong. The opposition connotes inside or outside or us, them thinking. That was a quote. Antagonism, he says, is reminiscent of binary code. The filtering systems on the front end of the platform follow the logic of the back end of the interface, designed by a binary polarization of ones and zeros. Galloway, in his book on Laruelle, and I'm less interested in Laruelle here, I'm more interested in the way he's thinking the idea of digitization. Galloway writes similarly that the digital provides insights into philosophy and critical theory, which according to him is a, quote, a digitization of the real because it is predicated on the one dividing in two, end quote. The digital, he writes, is the basic distinction that makes possible any distinction at all. The digital is the capacity to divide things and make distinctions between them. Thus, he says, not so much 0 and 1, but 1 and 2. Galloway, in his reading here of the binary within the digital, sets out, I think, to examine it in a much more standard or positive or affirmationist way, whether that is in terms of the binary opposition as it is read, for instance, in Deconstruction, or maybe even in Maoist dialectics, or maybe the Abao-Julian version of the one dividing into two. But I think that it is by far more productive to read the binary opposition in the way that it is described by Simonovsky, where the 1 and the 0 represent the difference between the inside and the out, between the positive and the negative, or more appropriately, between the affirmation and the negation. When read in this manner, the binary opposition leads us to theorize not the 1 and the 2, but the self-relating of the 1 that takes precedence over the splitting into the 2. So while we encounter the binary between the affirmation and the negation, what really concerns us is the question of what is being affirmed or posited in this split. That is, we can turn to a different register beyond the digital and back towards the ideological, and switching our point of reference slightly towards the linguistic binary of the signifier. I think we can read the binary in a more traditional structural or post-structural way that helps us to think the relationship between the term or terms of the binary and the libidinal economy. In rethinking the binary in this way, I'm drawing somewhat on the work of Anna Kornbluh, who proposes that formalization or structure is a goal both of psychoanalysis and emancipatory politics. According to her, emancipatory politics can follow psychoanalysis by taking formalization as its goal. This is in stark contrast to much radical politics today, which sees smashing structures and states of structurelessness as its goal. Against this common orthodoxy, Kornbluh argues that a politics of universal emancipation needs to take the instituting capacity of the material signifier and the practice of institution of affirming but nevertheless limiting a structure as its central project. As she puts it, what psychoanalysis institutes is the thought and practice of a necessary but contingent state, that which stamps that which is formed, that which facilitates existence, And I would add here as well the apprehension of enjoyment. My interest in thinking the binary thus has to do in part with our current moment of relating to binary oppositions and structures of identity and culture, as in the sexual relationship, but also in terms of the political antagonism of the class struggle. I think it is reasonable to consider the parallel between the digital moment, as Galloway does, and critical theories of binary opposition as a way to remap the central contradictions of our time. My objective then is to think the relationship between emancipatory politics and ethics, and in this way the role of enjoyment, but along the lines of our thinking of the binary opposition. To put it bluntly, I agree with Kornblue that in contrast to some of the language in post-structural or postmodern theory, we need to defend a particular kind of structure or form rather than the elimination of structure as a goal for emancipatory politics. But I would add that doing so means also recognizing the way that social constructions do establish historically defined forms of power. Acknowledging this fact need not mean that emancipation equals the destruction of all structures. Certainly, emancipatory politics requires the negation of particularly limiting structures like capitalism, like patriarchy, like heteronormativity, like Eurocentrism. But to put the point differently, norms are absolutely constructed socially, but they are also established historically, and often still organically, even when structurelessness, as Joe Freeman explains, is the apparent aim. To make it even more clear, the binary opposition with which I am most concerned here is that between the 1 and the 0, between the positive and the negative, or between the affirmation and the negation. The affirmation of norms or the negation of norms, for instance. Nevertheless, it is with regards to the structures of social and cultural norms, I claim that there is an activation of desire and investment in libidinal economies. Sorry. If we consider the way that Joan Kopchik, for instance, distinguishes between the essentialist or dogmatic views of sex and the social constructionist or skeptical view of it, then what we should add is the historical dimension. This means that we acknowledge the social constructionist perspective, the object, sex, as discursive construct, accept it, but we also recognize that with every critique of a norm, we also at the same time impose a new one, the one from which the critique finds its basis of comparison. And in this way, we come to discover the inscription of a new necessary, however contingent, instituting signifier. The new master signifier, in other words, is the product of taking critique all the way to the end. It is not arbitrary. It is rather produced, as in the Lacanian discourse of the analyst, as a result of thinking contradiction to its endpoint. This new signifier, however, is nevertheless instituting of a new structure rather than the destruction of structure as such. We can read this well, for instance, through Alenka Zupancic's description of the Lacanian logic of the signifier following into the signified, or the symbolic having an effect in the real. She points out that the signifying structure is organized around a gap, that in order for the relational differentiality to exist and to function, the one of the binary relation has to be missing. This, she writes, makes all the difference, since this is Lacan's crucial addition, which allows him to reintroduce the concept of the subject of the unconscious at the very highest point of the structuralist attacking of this notion. But then she notes Lacan is quick to add that his point is to show how the signifier in fact enters the signified. Whether because of our knowledge of the real produced via discourse, so I'm moving on from Zupancic, whether because of our knowledge of the real produced via discourse or because of our non or unconscious knowledge of it, we are still made capable of acting upon the world and therefore changing it. Knowledge, connaissance, however, as opposed to consciousness, conscience, in the analytical discourse, is, I claim, that which makes us more free. Climate science is a parallel example. Coming to know nature through discourse makes it possible for us to act on it for better or worse, but this still carries an effect. What changes here is the register of the object in our frameworks of knowledge, allowing us to reflect upon and to ask what type of effect we can produce, or can we produce. It is this impact on the real, I claim, that always refers back to a foundational choice, a foundational decision between an affirmative and a negative, between the affirmation and the negation. Such a choice, I argue, is fundamentally attached to the conditions of our enjoyment or to our libidinal economy, which nevertheless is organized, is formed or structured with reference to a socially or culturally determined object or signifier, and or signifier. So going forward, I want to elaborate on the way that the binary I'm addressing is represented in the registers of Deleuze and Lacan. I don't know how far I can go on this, but we'll see. Okay. So Deleuze as the supposedly affirmationist theorist and Lacan as the theorist of negation of the negative or lack. Today, much of the critical ideological discourse finds its inspiration in the Deleuzo-Guattarian disdain for the imperialism of the despotic signifier. We see this, for instance, in varieties of new materialism, neo-vitalisms, and posthumanisms. These tendencies appear to privilege the analog over the digital, as Galloway might put it, proceeding from the substance's capacity for structureless self-organization or development. From this perspective, the introduction of the signifier into the real is what erroneously produces a split, or what Aaron Schuster calls, referring to Deleuze, the violence of the negative. The introduction of the splitting signifier in this sense inscribes negativity and contradiction into what is otherwise whole or substantial on its own. The introduction of the negative from this perspective is that which produces and creates a tyrannical or hierarchical structure which at the same time denies an affirmative desire. There is thus a sense in which new materialists of this source aim for return to a kind of immanence that breaks the shackles of an imposing signifier or obstacle. Although I wouldn't call Deleuze a monist, his project still seems to point at times to what Anton Sturkin calls an affirmative monism, which always presupposes the possibility of a return to vitalism. And I'm still kind of grappling with this, but I'm drawing on Sturkin to kind of make this claim. I believe we can detect this even in the way that Deleuze privileges the affirmation of difference and the multiple in his book on Nietzsche, where even the force of the negative is described as affirmation of an opposing aggression of the will. This claim regarding Deleuze's affirmative monism makes sense to me when we reflect upon the relationship between the subject and the obstacle in Deleuzian theory, and it is with regards to the position of the obstacle that we can distinguish between Deleuzian project of emancipation and the Lacanian one. Reading the binary through Lacan, we come to see that the posited two, as in the two sexes in the sexual relationship, for instance, are never two, but rather more foundationally the one and its void, the signifier and the lack. I prefer to think of this division as the affirmation of the phallic signifier of castration and its negation, so that both positions still relate to the signifier, but one remains limited, the masculine, whereas the other does not, the feminine. So going forward, we need to ask still, what is this void, this lack? We need to, I claim, read it as a foundational split within the subject itself, between the subject's self-positing affirmation as well as its self-reflecting negation. We should read this split from the position of what Zizek sometimes referred to as the foundational force choice of being. Since even here, as and with every choice that follows, choice is simultaneously the product of a split between the affirmation and the negation. Every choice made is at the same time the negation of choices not chosen. The imagery that I like to use is something, so as a digital example, the swiping logic of social media dating apps, so the choices you choose, the choices you don't choose, or my students now have me kind of obsessed with TikTok, so the constant scrolling, the choices you choose, the choices you don't choose. So I like that imagery to think about the swiping logic of the signifier. Whatever we affirm simultaneously negates some other content. This, I believe, is how we should understand symbolic castration in the Lacanian sense. The affirmation, the self-positing of the signifier, is also at the same time the negation of that little other choice not made. The unchosen other or object is thus the inverse side of the object chosen. The signifier chosen is the one for which now all of the others come to determine the subject, but still on the inverse side of this choice exists the lost object, the lost choice, which is translated into the object cause of the subject's desire. It is lack objectivized. What gets produced in the subject through the fantasy of attaining or acquiring this lost object is the curvature of its desire, its libidinal economy. Hence, the binary opposition is productive of both the subject and the unconscious and its libidinal economy. Todd McGowan, who I just saw came back in, Todd McGowan is quite clever here in relating the subject's desire to the logic of capital, or more specifically to the logic of the fetishism of the commodity. In his book on capitalism and desire, he makes the bold claim that capital plays on the subject's desire because it knows systematically that what the subject desires, the way that it invests into its libidinal economy, and this I would add is also one of the insights you can find in Lyotard's libidinal economy, as well as in Deleuze and Guattari's Capitalism and Schizophrenia. What it knows is oh, I just lost my place. It just knows that the subject, it's not the object, but the obstacle. That what the subject desires is not the object, but the obstacle preventing its realization. It's on this point that I agree with the reading of capitalism as that I disagree with the reading of capitalism as schizophrenic. Its formal discursive and libidinal shape is much closer to that of perversion. As Samo Tomczyk put that capitalism is not itself perverse, but it demands perversion from its subjects. It demands that subjects enjoy exploitation. That is to say, it imposes the perverse position on the subject. It's important to specify here the relationship between knowledge and its disavowal on the part of the perverse subject, who may appear to avow the non-existence of the object, but pursues it nonetheless, because that knowledge is in fact disavowed. As McGowan puts it elsewhere, the subject is able to acknowledge the hopelessness of consumption while simultaneously consuming with as much hope as the most naive consumer. But we might also read the relationship of the subject to its desire under capital in the form of the obsessional neurotic who constantly erects their own obstacles to the realization of desire, since enjoyment is procured through the chase. In either case, though, it is the positing of the obstacle that creates the conditions of possibility for enjoyment. But this, nevertheless, is a self-positing of the obstacle and not merely its imposition from outside. Therein lies a key difference between the libidinal economy in the Lacanian register and its interpretation in the Deleuzian one. From the Deleuzian perspective, the obstacle can be read as an external force negating the positive affirmative flow of desire. This is why it's important, contrary maybe to what I said above, not to read Deleuze as a monist, but as a dualist who still places emphasis on dialectic antagonism and conflict. If we can understand desire in the Lacanian register as lack as the negative, then in the Deleuzian one, it becomes an affirmative force. Everything then depends on where we locate the site of the obstacle. Is the obstacle imposed externally by some oppositional or exploitative force, or is it self-imposed, self-posited by the subject? Stop me if I'm going over time. Okay, so whereas the Deleuzian ethic is one of deterritorialization, the Lacanian one can be located in the idea that the end of analysis arrives once the subject avows the positing of its presupposition, that it has itself posited the obstacle as the only means for accessing enjoyment. But the conclusion to analysis reveals that the source of enjoyment is the fantasy and not what appears to lie beyond it. What the subject brings to consciousness is the inevitability of contradiction and the inability to transcend it. This, I would argue, gives the subject its freedom. It has the freedom to posit its own, or emancipation. It has the freedom to posit its own presuppositions. It has the freedom to impose its own obstacles or its own limits or limitations. But how do we arrive at this position? How might we read, in other words, Lacan's motto, do not give up on your desire? I think the first thing to do here is to begin with negation rather than with the affirmation. The subject is split by the desire to transcend contradiction and the desire to pursue contradiction. We should, in other words, proceed with the negation as the starting point of choice, where freedom is the continuous act of saying, that's not it, I am not that, or even the neurotic question of, why am I that? Why am I what you are saying I am? Or even in the political register, it is necessary to negate real material forces that do oppose from outside the freedom of the subject. The structural contradictions of capital, for instance, create real material barriers for subjects needing to access resources of living. Certainly, we need to oppose such external forces, that is obvious. And freedom here surely is the result of the practice of negation. History, after all, is made by the masses, but in conditions not of their own choosing, or to put it differently, the base may determine the superstructure, but revolutionary class can still negate the base. Freedom here is produced as negation, of negating all of the subject's determinations, whether biological, cultural, or political. Desire here should be read as the object cause that initiates freedom through negation, which is still aiming towards a particular object. So we can see here the splitting of the drive between its goal, which is its target, and its aim, which is forever to circulate around its goal. But at a certain point, as McGowan notes, negation can only but prop up what it opposes and what it negates. At a certain point, it must set its own limits, its own determinations, and affirm whatever necessary, however contingent structure is required for the realization of its freedom. The Deleuze-Guattarian ethic, in contrast, is one of seeking to affirm desire rather than structure, which gets inhibited by some external negating and contradictory force. I I have a rather long quote from Deleuze's Nietzsche, which I'm just going to skip over just for time. Yeah. Okay, so the difference between freedom in the Deleuzean register and its place in the Lacanian one concerns the position of the obstacle. For Deleuze, desire is an affirmative force that gets thwarted by an external imposing obstacle. Contradiction and negation are imposed upon the subject's positive substantial desire. For Lacan, desire is lack, the desire to avoid contradiction and the drive to pursue contradiction, lack in objective form. And the obstacle is self-imposed as a limit that the subject self-posits rather than simply being imposed by the other. So if I can return to the problem of the binary opposition, we can see, first of all, that we're speaking about the opposition, or rather the contradiction between the affirmation and the negation, that the contradiction between them is vital to the interpellation of the subject, and that the interpellation of the subject is at the same time the emergence of its libidinal economy, hence my very long and stupid title. Our question remains, must emancipation follow the path of the destruction of the limit or the obstacle, that is, towards an aspiration in the direction of structuralist deterritorialization, or in the direction of a legitimate self-imposed structure needed both for the realization of enjoyment and fantasy and for universal freedom? So by way of affirming my own commitments, I want to conclude by referring to two texts that I think best express my own current position. The first is McGowan's book on Hegel, and the other one is Anna Kornbluth's Forthcoming, The Order of Forms, which identifies formalization as structuration as an emancipatory logic. Both of these texts demonstrate for me the relationship between the psychoanalytic and dialectical materialist project of emancipation, but both also posit the necessity of a formal structure of law, or at the very least a universal concept that we give to ourselves as the only avenue for realizing universal freedom. Effectively, what they propose in the Lacanian sense, the production of a new signifier, the production of the new, so that the affirmation of the new signifier, the production of a new historical norm, posits both the formal logic of emancipation as well as its enjoyment. This new arrives, in other words, not merely by some completely conscious choice or action, but by following our desire and thinking it all the way to our logical end. It's this that makes the dialectic of enjoyment, the dialectic of the binary, affirmation and negation, an emancipatory political factor. Thank you.